following program is presented as a public service by the Patrick Butler Family Foundation.
For my son and God, hand to hand on Knocknaveen, if I saw my son down, it is then I would say that God was a strong man.
KTCA-TV, St. Paul, Minneapolis, presents Ireland Rediscovered, a series of 13 programs dealing with the significance of the Irish nation which has emerged to statehood in our own times. Dr. John McKiernan, head of the Department of English at the College of St. Thomas in St. Paul and an authority on Ireland, is host and lecturer. The title of this program is Warriors and Lovers, a program on the literature of Ireland. Here again is Professor McKiernan.
In the last talk on this series, we told about the heroic tales of Ulster, the tales that have given us such heroes, such great figures of literature as Cuchulainn and that tragic queen Deirdre. Now in this talk we move to another cycle of tales, several centuries later. The Cuchulainn tales, remember, were really tales of a pre-Christian kind of civilization, a civilization that was haughty, aristocratic, proud, warlike, a civilization that valued the natural virtues highly. Now we move to a time of approximately the 3rd century after Christ. We move to a type of knighthood, if you don't mind my using a much, much later phrase, a type of knighthood civilization in which the natural virtues are still there and raised to a great height, but nonetheless there is a greater gentleness in the civilization. We are going to talk then in this lecture about Finn MacCool, a name that I'm sure you have heard often. Finn MacCool and his son Oisin, can be pronounced Oisin. O-I-S-I-N is the spelling in Irish. These tales have circulated widely in both Ireland and Scotland. And the spelling that is most familiar to you may happen to be the O-S-S-I-A-N, the Oisin of James Macpherson, the Scottish writer of the 18th century. Well, we start the tales then of Oisin, the son of Finn, the tales that tell us of the poet Oisin, the warrior father Finn, and the warrior son of Oisin, who has the name of Oscar, which might sound Germanic to you, but is the hero, one of the heroes, the name of one of the heroes of this earlier cycle. These then are the tales of Finn, his son Oisin, and Oisin's son Oscar. These men in English are called the Fenians, in Irish Fenia, and the stories about them Finiachta. They were a very interesting group, partly mythological, of course. I don't want you to take all of this for pure history. Actually, the name of Vienna in Austria is named after the Celtic Finn, who in Ireland, whose name in Ireland appears to us under the spelling F-I-N-N or F-I-O-N-N. So that these tales are of great antiquity and go back to the lives of the Celts on the continent. That is, at least the names of the characters go back to the Celtic experiences on the continent. Now, however, we're going to talk about these tales as they are centered in Ireland, and in an Ireland presumably of the 3rd century A.D. This does not mean that the characters were historical, but it does mean that the earlier mythological qualities of the tales could eventually have settled upon reasonably historic characters. You had a similar experience, of course, in the Arthurian tales, and you're familiar, no doubt, with that sort of historic development. Now, the Fenians then, or the Fianna, it's interesting that one of the political parties in Ireland today is called Fianna Fáil. The Fianna, the Fenians, the Knights of destiny. Well, the Fianna then were a body of warriors, you might say mercenaries, who sold or gave their services, a body of men who lived by either by outright war or by the maintenance of peace. They had a very strict code. Actually, certain injunctions were laid upon them so that entrance into their group was well, a bit more difficult than to get into some of our very difficult unions today, for instance. For instance, they pledged never to take a dowry with a wife. After all, that's rather hard to give up if you've been accustomed to that in your civilization. But you see, one of their promises was, we never take a dowry with a wife. We choose a wife for her manners and her virtue. We have need of no other dowry. Another of their injunctions, another of their self-imposed disciplines was that they would never offer violence to anyone. Thirdly, if they were asked a gift of any of their possessions, they would give it away. And lastly, the very interesting one, that they would never retire before more than 10-to-1 odds, that a single member of the Fianna would always take on up to 9 opponents before he would dare think of turning his back. His parents, when a man entered the Fianna, his parents had to agree that whatever might happen to him, they would never seek revenge, or in the old Irish civilization, they would never seek what was called the blood price, that is, the compensation due to them if he were killed or injured or seriously maimed. Well, a great many tales grew up around this group, presumably a group in the 3rd century. And they remained exceedingly popular. In fact, this is one of the most extraordinary things in the history of the world's literature, that these tales maintained a literary evolution and development for easily 1,500 years. Now, there's hardly anything in the history of any nation in the world to match this kind of literary development and evolution. It is an extraordinary fact. And it might be hard for us to believe that shortly after the death of, let us say, Shakespeare, shortly after the time of Spenser and Shakespeare in England, and well before Milton had come to his prime, an Irish soldier on the continent, a Captain Sorley MacDonell, an Irish soldier, one of the numberless, driven out of Ireland under the influence of English occupation, one of these soldiers by the name of Captain MacDonell, who was serving in the armies of Spain, in the middle of the 17th century, collected and brought together many, many of these ancient tales of Finn and his warriors, produced a collection which today we call Dúnadh Finn, or the poem book of Finn. Now, isn't that extraordinary, you see, how so far removed from Ireland, fighting in the lowlands under the flag of Spain, he should come into contact with fleeing refugees from Ireland and collect from them these tales which were old when Chaucer was writing. So this, I think, gives us a little taste of the antiquity of these and also of their great popularity. And then you may know from your studies in English literature of the 18th century Scottish poet Macpherson, who allegedly, or who made what he called translations of these old tales, which of course were really not translations, but they did use the old characters of Oisin and his father Finn and his son Oscar and Cuiltia and other comrades and members of the Fianna. And these tales in the translations of Oisin actually became very, very popular with people like Goethe, with Napoleon, with Thomas Jefferson. In fact, they enjoyed quite a craze for a good while in the 18th century and the earlier part of the 19th century. So you see, there's really a great romance surrounding the romances of Finn, Oisin, and Oscar. Many, many tales, and most of them really are quite delightful. Now, in really the few minutes that I have on this program, I can only tell you, give you the introduction, really, to a few of them. One of these is a very interesting one, which is called The Colloquy of the Ancients. I'm going to read you a few selections and make a few comments about it, but should you be interested in reading this in something like a modern edition, you might find this book in the library called The Return of the Hero. This is a 20th century treatment of this very, very old story, because this Colloquy of the Ancients is one of the longest of the Finn and Oisin tales. It's quite unique in Irish literature. This one itself was composed about the 13th century, so it's not the oldest, but it is very interesting. It tells of, remember I said that Finn and Oisin were supposedly in the 3rd century, and you do know that St. Patrick came to Ireland in the 5th century. Now, in the Colloquy of the Ancients, we have Oisin carrying on a conversation with St. Patrick. This makes a little problem, doesn't it? 3rd to the 5th century. And of course, that's neatly taken care of by the story of Oisin, who in the 3rd century, after the defeat of the Fenians, they were dispersed by the king. Their power became too great. And after the defeat of the Fenians, Oisin went away to the Tír na nÓg, the land of the young, this beautiful isle far across in the western seas, the Irish Atlantis, I suppose. But Oisin went there with a beautiful girl who had ridden over the waves on a snow-white steed, ridden over the waves from Tír na nÓg to Ireland, and there she beckoned to Oisin. And after all, what could a warrior do but follow the behest of a beautiful lady? So he mounted behind her on the steed, and away they rode over the waves. You might remember a modern Irish play, which has often been done in this country, called The White Steed by Paul Vincent Carroll. References to this great romance, ironic references perhaps. But at any rate, away they go to the land of the young, and there the days were as centuries. So that when Oisin returned to Ireland, thinking he had been away but 48, 72 hours, he had actually been away for a little over 2 centuries. And here he finds Patrick and the Christians. They're smaller in stature. They seem a bit more glum, a bit more dour than the joyous pagan friends. And Oisin is hard put to explain all of this. And there ensues then a dialogue, the colloquy of the ancients. Here is this man who had ridden away, a stalwart, shining knight, and then when he returns, centuries older, he's still this stalwart, shining knight until he puts his foot on the soil of Ireland, and then his age descends upon him. So now here is this 2.5 to 3 centuries old giant of a man talking to the Christians. And this was composed, as I remarked to you before, in the 13th century. And it has that beautiful, exuberant, medieval irreverence, that same kind of irreverence which could put the most delightful gargoyles upon some of the European cathedrals, gargoyles that sometimes whose humor we can't quite enjoy. So just a little taste of the debate between them. Oisin says to Patrick, "O Patrick of the crooked crozier, who makest me that impertinent answer, thy crozier would be atoms were Oscar present. Were my son and God hand to hand on Knocknaveen, if I saw my son down, it is then I would say that God was a strong man." Well, you can imagine the reaction of Patrick, just simply shocked at the paganism of this man and his disrespect for God. And matters aren't helped any when Patrick tries to bring him along in the way of salvation and talks to him of fasting and penance. Oisin just cannot see the relevance of this to life. Food was given to man to enjoy it. Man was made to laugh. He was made for the hunt and the chase. And he was made to kiss the pretty women, to act toward them in a gallant way. Well, Patrick and he have a hard time getting along. Patrick is a bit patient. At times, he asks Oisin, tell me about these men. Tell me what sorts of lives they led. And Oisin gladly obliged Patrick. And Patrick found such delight in the stories that he began to wonder whether these tales weren't distracting him from his religious duties and perhaps even his religious life. But such was the love and appreciation in 13th century Ireland for these tales of Ireland of 1,000 years before, as it were, that the author of this has Patrick consult an angel, and the angel says to him, "Oh, Patrick, by no means. These are glorious tales. Write them down, that men in the centuries hence may enjoy them. And just think, you've had an opportunity at least to have heard about them, and some of you may get the chance to do some reading in them." Now, another great tale in this cycle is an entirely different one, the tale called The Pursuit of Diarmuid and Grania. This is a very interesting one, a fairly long one, which actually is part of the basic structure from which the continental story of Tristan and Isolde developed. Actually, you know, that tale which we find in German and French music, this tale is Celtic in its origins. And one of the plays, if you will, upon that tale is the tale of Diarmuid and Grania. Now, it happened, you see, that Finn awakened one day feeling rather irritable. He hadn't slept too well. And his son questioned him and said, "Well, why have you arisen so early? What's the problem?" And he says, "Not without cause have I made this early rising. For I am without a wife, since Magnus, the daughter of Garrod Glundov, has died. For he is not wont to have slumber nor sweet sleep, who happens to be without a fitting wife. And that is the cause of my early rising, O Oisin." Well, Oisin says, "Well, after all, we can get you a wife without very great difficulty." And they talk about it, and Oisin points out that the wife of the High King of Ireland, Cormac MacArt, an historical personage, by the way, I'm sorry, not the wife, but the daughter of Cormac MacArt, is a very beautiful girl. Her name is Grania, and she would make certainly a fitting wife for so great a warrior as Finn. Well, obviously, if Finn has a grown son here to advise him, he's a bit on in years. Grania is a bit younger, but Oisin goes and rather, Finn asks Oisin, "Well, now, why don't you go?" See, here's the John Alden. "Why don't you go and ask for me?" So that Oisin agrees to go, and he speaks to Cormac MacArt and bespeaks the hand of his daughter for his father. And Grania is asked by her father, "What do you think of this?" And she's very obedient in her reply, despite the fact that she had already refused a number of suitors. She says, "Father, if he be a fitting son-in-law for thee, why should he not be a fitting husband for me?" It seems then that things would be rather easy. So Finn comes with a retinue of warriors, and Grania now beholds Finn and sees him as a man whose hair is graying, a man who's alongside his own son, shows the toll of the years. So she begins to have second thoughts about it. And in the course of the preparations, she prepares some drugged wine and offers it to Finn and a number of his closest warrior friends. And they drink it and fall into a deep sleep. And then she says to Diarmuid that it is he whom she has really loved, having caught sight of him accidentally once before, and so on and so forth. Diarmuid is appalled. Diarmuid cannot take away the consort promised to his own captain. And such are the bonds of loyalty amongst the Fianna that not for one moment did he entertain the belief or the hope that he could take away such a beautiful woman promised to his captain. Well, now, in old Irish civilization, there was a curious kind of arrangement. Difficult maybe for us to understand today unless we have read something about the operation of taboos in the world. But these taboos existed in ancient Irish civilization. The Irish word was gassa. So Grania said, well, I lay gassa upon thee. I put thee under gasses of danger and of destruction, O Diarmuid. That is, under gassa of mighty druidism, if thou take me not with thee out of this household tonight, ere Finn and the king my father awaken. A warrior could not disobey, could not violate, could not go against gassa. So here was a very sad case. He turned to Asheen, and he turned to one or two other friends of his, younger men who had not been given the drugged drink. And he said, what am I to do? And they pointed out to him, you have no choice but to obey the gassa. One of his comrades, Caoilte, says, look, Diarmuid, I have a fitting wife, and yet I had rather than the wealth of all the world that Grania had spoken to me. And he turns to another friend and asks him, what can I do? And his friend can say, I tell thee, follow Grania, though thy death will come of it, and I grieve for it. So here is this situation then, where by virtue of the promises he had taken when he became a member of the Fianna, he had now to follow out the gassa. And thus we have a tale now which is not confined to Ulster, as the Cuchulainn and Deirdre tales were, but a tale now which traces its path all over Ireland as the lovers flee before the vengeance of Finn. We have a repetition of the dangers that they go through, all of them highly interesting and so on, but a repetition of dangers. For instance, one such example, and these are filled with feats of prowess on the part of Diarmuid, who is after all a great warrior. The Isle, Finn, for instance, invites assistance from outside Ireland, and 3 great chieftains come from the Isle of Wight, and they're going to help track down Diarmuid. And in one of those dashes of dramatic irony, so beloved by the old writers here, they meet Diarmuid and ask, do you know the whereabouts of this man? Well, Diarmuid said, I myself am but a warrior, who am walking the world by the strength of my hand, but I did see him yesterday, and I'm telling you, he's no ordinary man. I did see a man who saw him yesterday, and I tell you, he's no ordinary man. Well, to make a long story short, through mighty trials of strength and craft, Diarmuid vanquishes these men. And in the pursuit of Diarmuid and Grania, Finn eventually comes up and finds the remnants of these men and their host. Well, now, Finn had very often come upon the track of Diarmuid. In fact, if you go throughout Ireland, it's worse than George Washington slept here, because virtually every place you go, particularly where you find dolmens or some other features of the land that lend themselves to this interpretation, the ancient tradition will say that was the bed of Grania and Diarmuid. That's where Grania and Diarmuid slept. So dear to the hearts of Irish, or the heart of Irish tradition, has this story been, you see. Well, to make a long story short, eventually I'm sorry, Finn had many times come upon the track of these people, and Diarmuid, to show that he had been true to his vow and that he had not really taken Grania for his beloved, he would always leave a piece of uncooked salmon or other deer, for instance, other meat that they had, leave a piece uncooked where they had slept, so that coming upon it, Finn could interpret that as a sign that he had by no means taken to wife this woman. But eventually, of course, as they were pursued night and day for many long years all over the country, eventually he did take Grania to wife, and she bore him 4 sons and a daughter. And eventually, Finn did encompass the death of Diarmuid through a rather supernatural way. That is, Diarmuid was under Gassa, never to hunt a wild boar. And Finn arranged one day that a hunt for a wild boar should take place in the neighborhood in which he knew Diarmuid to be. So Diarmuid slew the boar, but the boar slew Diarmuid too. And as he lay dying, Diarmuid said to his captain, "You can heal me, for you have the gift of healing, if you will but bring me from the spring yonder in your cupped hands a drink of water." Finn refused to do this, and then you have this very poignant scene in which Diarmuid reminds him of several occasions on which he had saved the life of Finn. And Finn's own son, Aishin, says to his father eventually, "You go and do it, or you and I will have to fight this out here." So eventually, on the 3rd attempt, he does manage to bring the water to Diarmuid, but just as he gets there with it, Diarmuid had been in his last agonies and he died. The outcome, the rather ironic outcome of it all, was that eventually Finn took to himself Grania, with her free will and so on. Now, that's a very inadequate outline of one of the lovely tales of love in Ireland centuries ago, one of the tales bound up with this great cycle of tales which has traveled far and wide outside of Ireland even, but tales which could still be taken down at the beginning of the 20th century in Ireland. And I think one of the most remarkable matters or remarks that we could make about these tales is the chivalry that they taught. For the motto of the Fenians, or the Fianna, was this: truth in our hearts. Purity in our hearts, truth on our lips, and strength in our hands. Neart na lavi, firna na jangi, agus glanya no grihi. And I don't think any one of us can believe that such noble ideals held up in popular literature for centuries upon centuries could have had any but a fine effect upon the people who cherished them. So that in that respect, you see, the tales are not only a great literary heritage, but certainly must have shaped the Irish character.
Ireland Rediscovered is produced by KTCA-TV, Twin Cities Area Educational Television Corporation. The next title in this series is The Tradition of the People. Host and lecturer is Dr. John McKiernan. Ireland Rediscovered is directed by Carl Brookins and produced by Joseph T. McDermott. This program was presented as a public service by the Patrick Butler Family Foundation.